Hey there everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Sylvere Lotringer's essay, The Dance of Signs. This is a really wonderful essay in the spirit of Anti-Oedipus and the sort of Deleuze and Guattarian critique of Freudian psychoanalysis. And what Lotringer is going to be looking at in this essay is Gradiva, and particularly Freud's analysis of Gradiva. And Gradiva is a novella, but inspired by a Roman relief, which I have pictured on the screen here, of this woman. And there's a novella written on it, and in that novella is a dream by one of the main characters who Freud is analyzing here and trying to, do the Freudian thing where he puts all of this meaning that always is going to tie back themes in the dream to a repressed childhood memory, which is latent in the unconscious, but needs to be made conscious such that one can deal with it and continue living a normal life, having surpassed this psychological problem. Now, Lotringer in this essay is going to be doing a sort of anti-Freudian reading of Gradiva, and particularly of this dream, in terms of looking at the way that desire manifests itself in dreams, and particularly motion, in a way that actually cannot be fully rested, cannot be fully consumed or subsumed by language or representation. And in this way, Sylvere Lotringer is doing a very Deleuzian sort of anti-representation critique of dream analysis. Three quotes open up this essay, which I think are very pertinent to the topics of this essay. The first is Merche Cunningham, "Even when immobile, we are in motion," which I think, of course, testifies to this classic, we like to think that we are immobile, but in actuality, even like physical stuff is actually not immobile. It's this constant bustling about of atoms which we're just not aware of. And then the second of these quotes is from John Cage. "What counts is to put the individual in flux. One must destroy the wall of the ego, weaken opinions, memory, and emotions, tear down all the ramparts." And John Cage is getting at something really important to the sort of schizoanalytic process that Lotringer is doing here, that we're trying to bring out the flux in the dream. And in order to do this, we have to tear down the ego. This is in the same way that Deleuze and Guattari use the id at the beginning of Anti-Oedipus. What a mistake to have ever said the id. What is trying to be done here is breaking down a monistic understanding of the unconscious as always being prefigured and structured by these essentially pre-psychological structures such as Oedipus. So in this way, Sylvere Lotringer is looking at the unconscious, looking at the way it's been organized and structured by structuralism, and looking at the way the interpretation actually frames a rather reductive and reactive reading of the unconscious that doesn't actually allow for creativity or allow for moving beyond these things which have been imposed on someone, such as the Oedipus complex. And then the third quote here is from Friedrich Nietzsche: "That which is cannot contain motion." And it's particular to note that this is not a sort of Parmenidean "that which is cannot be in motion," but rather that which is cannot contain motion, which is to say that that which is motion itself. It is Dionysian in the classic sense. It springs forth and goes beyond logical constraints or symbolic constraints. And that, of course, is the illusion within the title, The Dance of Signs. It's the dance in the same sort of Nietzschean sense in which Zarathustra says, I could only believe in a God which could dance. There's a sort of frivolity that Lotringer is trying to bring out of dreams here. And he wants to focus on interpretive power and about the link between dreams and power, not dreams and signification. Because, of course, the problem with signification is it leads Freud to looking at dreams and saying, okay, what do these really mean? I know this is showing me something, but I know that's not what it really means. And, of course, Freud is bringing his own interpretive schema, his own structuralist schema, and his own sort of theoretical interpretations as baggage into the dream analysis. And Lotringer's objectivity is actually a pure fiction, an interpretation in its own right, but disavowed. The choice of elements, their grouping, the logic at work, etc., are anything but neutral. Structuralists insist on hiding behind a self-imposed logical organization. Freud defines a goal and arranges the facts accordingly. And then he continues, the man of pure knowledge boastfully practices self-effacement. He preaches liberation from all effects. So there's a problem here of Freud can sort of abstract himself away from the immediate effects of the situation and claim to have this liberated way of looking at dreams, this objective way of course, interpreting dreams. But the objectivity of interpretation, because that's what objectivity is meaning for Lotringer in this context, it's a total fiction. There is no objectivity because you bring with yourself your own world. This is a very Heideggerian point. So you can't neutrally interpret, just like for Heidegger, you can't neutrally understand die Seinsfrage, the question of being, because you're always already in being. Being is a clearing which opens out into the world and goes beyond pure logical constraints of groupings, of choices of elements, because you're always pushed beyond your own choices. And that's what Lotringer is trying to bring out in dream analysis, is that we have to go beyond our own choices of elements. And we have to be presented with something and not be satisfied with a recourse to the past. In this same vein, we move into this sort of second subchapter here titled Perspective Valuations, where he quotes Friedrich Nietzsche here from The Will to Power. How much of a piece of music has been understood when that in which is calculable has been reckoned up? So, right, there's this, you can kind of calculate something and you can get part of it, but how much of a piece of music have you really understood just by calculating it and not living it? For example, I went to see Mahler's First Symphony live for the first time. I've never seen Mahler live before. And part of the magic of a live performance of a Mahler symphony is that Mahler uses these intense emotive outbursts of percussion mixed with major chords, and the physical experience of those sound waves hitting your body is the likes of which is not calculable for Nietzsche. It is the power of the aesthetic experience which moves beyond merely logical constraints and into the affective realm, which of course is a very important one for Lotringer and Deleuze and Guattari. Lotringer writes, "The world has no value in itself. It waits for my evaluation. I never find it, though, in a pristine state. It is always already shaped by interpretations." He says, but what makes a superior interpretation in a world of no truth? Reading a text raises similar problems. However much I try to disregard previous evaluations, I have to confront textual configurations whose economy I can never totally upset, but merely modify. And that's important because there is a sort of liminal dance going on here, right, of how to interpret a text when there's no one true interpretation. There's multiple different possible angles, especially for something like music, which is at its surface affective and not logical or calculated necessarily. I mean, even in the process of creating music, you can only constrain it to such a degree to where you have to let, for example, the live aspects of performance take it beyond that into the lived realm. And in looking at the text, Lotringer is pointing out, of course, that you can't disregard previous evaluations. You're always bound in the state of the text, which is not some objective, pristine state, but rather it's already shaped and it already has been shaped, whether you wanted it to or not. But also, there is an economy internal to the text, a dance or a rhythm unique to the text, which can never be totally upset by one's interpretation. One can modify it and bring out certain elements. And as such, Lotringer says a text has as many meanings as it has forces capable of dominating it. So in this way, Freudian analysis is framed from the perspective of a powerful method of interpretation. It is a framework which, of course, has its own ups and downs, and Lotringer is trying to get beyond it by overcoming the temptation of total interpretations, as he says. To destroy the belief in the law, to dissipate the fiction of predictability, to reject the sage recurrence of the same. This is not just a critical stand, it is an act of force. But destruction must not open onto an absence of values, worthless or meaningless. It must lead to a new evaluation. And this is Nietzsche through and through right here. You can go through the three metamorphoses where you go from the camel to the lion to the child. So you go from carrying the heavy burden, kind of being in a nihilistic state of going out into the desert of the real, so to speak, to use a Baudrillardian phrase. And then you can become the lion, you can become the destroyer of all values, the one who is willing to raise down that which they came from and become the powerful spirit, the sacred no-sayer. But then what makes the child, for Nietzsche, and this is the height of the sort of Dionysian phase of humanity, of the Übermensch, for Nietzsche, is to be able to create, to be able to, yes, destroy old values, destroy the old tablets of values, but also create new ones. And as such, Lotringer's stance here, I put on the thumbnail, for example, that this is an anti-Freudian dream analysis. And it's always hard to know, how people like Lotringer or Deleuze and Guattari are situated towards Freud, because, for example, Deleuze's difference in repetition was heralded as this reinvigoration of Freud, when in fact today Deleuze is kind of seen as a reinvigorator of Marx in kind of a different guise. So there's always a sort of, Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do schizoanalysis, and Lotringer is trying to do something similar here. So it's not just reduced to being anti-Freud or contra-Freud. It's not just doing the negative opposite of Freud. It's taking some of his analyses and deinstitutionalizing them, maybe, in a sort of Guattarian sense. It's taking off the temptation of totalization and not being satisfied with just a negative critical stand, but a critical stand which uses the force of the dream and accentuates the creative power within the dream itself, such that we can bring out the autonomy of the dream itself. We can bring out the practice that the dream engages in, almost irrespective of our thoughts about it. Because, right, there is an autonomy to a work of art, to Gradiva, to a text, in a way that, of course, makes it go beyond us. That's the important thing about why reading literature, for example, is so interesting because even reading these bare signs on a page, in the semiotic sense, all these little words with meanings and significations, nevertheless, they don't reduce to just the same thing. Like, each time you read a new word, it's in a new context. And as such, you can't just see it in a bubble. I mean, Lotringer says as much when he says a reactive force is not tied down to an intangible object defined independently of the specific situations in which it appears. So, right, we're getting out of the idealistic stage of Freud where he can sort of abstract the dreams away from what's actually going on and revert back to childhood. Instead, we're bringing it into the here and now, into the motion that's happening and trying to figure out how to cope with it. And this is at the center of these schizoanalytic theories, the likes of Deleuze, Guattari, and Lotringer, and maybe even Oeckingham, is that it is pragmatic. It's dealing with the here and now in a way that, Freud claims to fight repression. But as Lotringer is going to show, that is precisely by instituting the object of repression at the core, which is childhood and the Oedipus complex, in a way that you can never really escape from. You can either try to resolve it or, you can go into neuroses. Instead, we're dealing with a pragmatic approach to psychology and to dream analysis and to desire in a way that doesn't reject truth at the same time of rejecting interpretation. As Nietzsche says here in The Will to Power, to read off a text without interposing an interpretation is hardly possible. So, right, we've always got this subjective element, this perspectival element of kind of framing the way that we approach a text. But Lotringer says, I must use my creative forces to create values without falling into the inertia of truth or an anemia of will. I must render the text and the world to their disturbing and enigmatic character, will them incomprehensible, elusive, in flux, only indebted to perspective evaluations. And he quotes The Will to Power here. The greater the impulse toward the unity, the more firmly may one conclude that weakness is present. The greater the impulses toward variety, differentiation, inner decay, the more force is present. And then he goes on his own. Inner decay, to dance away over oneself. Motion, not emotions. So, right, that's sort of the difference between affects and emotions or feelings, is that affect is something impersonal. It comes from without, and even after being interpreted through one's subjective experience, these affects nevertheless lead one to, some sort of realization, some sort of feeling of euphoria. This would be like the divine in Bataille's sense of the word. And Lotringer's problem, he says as much here. Freud's interpretation resists the false neutrality of science. It only shows a sign of decline when it aims for the truth, when it succumbs to the temptation of unity, the sick security of monism, the illusion of a reconciliation. A reactive interpretation. It assumes powerful but fabricated weapons. The difference between objects and subjects, cause and effect, means and ends, etc. And these causes are always going to be some sort of childhood event for Freud, at least in part. And we're going to talk about the two-legged model of causes in Freud's work in a moment, part of which, of course, is the current events, and then the other leg of that being the childhood elements. But Lotringer is trying to frame Freud's interpretations as, yes, he's not trying to go for neutrality. He knows that he's bringing his own interpretive schema. He just thinks it's a good interpretive schema. But Lotringer is trying to, at the very least, point out that it is reactive. It is reacting to the dream, to the manifest oniric content instead of using that as an active element which will lead to some new creation. Lotringer says kind of a classic schizoanalytic, in a sense, phrase. I will learn to resist the melody of causal relations and the torpor of narrative accumulations in order to reinvent the intensity of risks, ceaselessly menacing and forever being reborn. And this is, of course, one of the main gripes with schizoanalysis, is that it is risky. It's going to take one to the limits of, these different flows are going to be accentuated in all their raw, potentially destructive power, kind of operating on the edge. Deleuze and Guattari constantly talk about the rough edges of reterritorialization and deterritorialization. And Deleuze and Guattari call this a sort of homemade atom bomb of an activity. So there's something dangerous in going to these limits of, the dissolution of the ego, like John Cage talked about, and in a sense, what Deleuze and Guattari talk about. And we are forever rebirthing our analysis, but of course always making it reborn anew, in the sense of Nietzsche's eternal return. The eternal return of difference itself, this is Deleuze's whole point in Difference and Repetition, basically, is that one must repeat the difference that always comes back as different in, for example, a dream, which is exactly how reality works. That you're always, just like I said, when you're reading off a page, you're not technically reading the same words, because they mean slightly different things in each moment, in each different reincarnation of those. And in each rebirth of a dream, or each rebirth of some affective element, it means something different. And that's the main thing that Freud fails to do, that Lotringer, as well as Deleuze and Guattari, are trying to pick up, and they're saying, okay, life is always being reborn. There's always something new going on. It's always a new day. So we shouldn't just recourse to the same old interpretive schema that's static. And instead, we need to figure out how to go beyond this sort of subject-object dualism, this separation of causes and effects, and look at the reality of the here and now, where those boundaries start to blur. In the next subchapter, Repression Now, Lotringer looks at the centrality of repression in Freud's analysis and says only through the insufficiency of the present can the machinery of repression, the cornerstone of the psychoanalytic edifice, be sustained. The eternal search for an origin, a cause, an anterior point of emission to explain the present psychic reality. So there's always this need to search further and further back to get to the primal cause, to get to the real cause. And in this way, repression of Oedipus is built on bringing to light causes which Freud essentially invents. Oftentimes he's like, well, this is what this really means, or this is some event that you may have experienced. I think of, for example, Freud's analysis of the Wolfman, where he's like, oh, this actually is about you seeing your parents have sex when you were like 4 years old. And I know you have no memory of it, but I'm telling you this is what it means. And this stands in for a repressed state that points to the inadequacy of one's current state. So the inadequacy or lack of the current state is built into the psychoanalytic project in Freud's sense. And Lotringer tries to point out that, in fact, forgetting can be something good. Being in the present and not having to be accountable to your 4-year-old self at all times. Being able to move beyond that. That is what Freud doesn't let you do. Freud doesn't let you get past your 4-year-old self. You're always a child for Freud. You're always an interpretive child for Freud who needs to be analyzed. But Lotringer says forgetting does not lack anything. It even becomes assertive or affirmative. It literally places Norbert besides himself. Norbert is the person in the Gradiva novella. It liberates him from his spatiotemporal attachments and projects him into an intensive present by essence foreign to the consequential logic of repression. Whatever the causes, not to remember is to erase the past in favor of the new. And of course, this is not Lotringer saying that the past isn't important. No. But what Freud's problem is Freud uses the past to overwrite the present. The present in the form of the dream is only ever a sort of bump in the road on the way to get back to the past and reify and essentially scientifically, quote unquote, prove the Oedipus complex. But what Lotringer is saying is that by forgetting this past, in a sense, by being accountable to the here and now and trying to figure out the signifiance or meaning or power, really is what Lotringer is focusing on, of the elements of a dream, we get past this sort of one-eyed interpretation of the logic and meaning of quote-unquote repressed elements in a dream. Now, I know this might be a little bit out of the way, but I think it is important that we actually just look at the dream in question so that we can see what Freud and Lotringer have to go off of. And of course, the main character here is Norbert. And in this next section, the dreams of interpretation, the dream is conveyed to us. Soon after his pedestrian investigations had yielded him this knowledge, he had one night a dream which caused him great anguish of mind. In it he was in old Pompeii, and on the 24th of August of the year 79 A.D., which witnessed the eruption of Vesuvius. The heavens held the doomed city wrapped in a black mantle of smoke. Only then and there the flaring masses of flame from the crater made distinguishable through the rift something steeped in blood-red light. All the inhabitants, either individually or in confused crowds, stunned out of their senses by the unusual horror, sought safety in flight. The pebbles and the rain of ashes fell down on Norbert also, but after the strange manner of dreams, they did not hurt him. And in the same way, he smelled the deadly sulfur fumes, or the air without having his breathing impeded by them. As he stood thus at the edge of the forum near the temple of Jupiter, he suddenly saw Gradiva a short distance in front of him. Until then, no thought of her presence there had moved him, but now suddenly it seemed natural to him, as she was of course a Pompeian girl, that she was living in her native city, and without his having any suspicion of it, was his contemporary. He recognized her at first glance. The stone model of her was splendidly striking in every detail, even in her gait. Involuntarily, he designated this as lente festinans. So, with buoyant composure and the calm unmindfulness of her surroundings peculiar to her, she walked across the flagstones of the forum to the temple of Apollo. She seemed not to notice the impending fate of the city, but to be given up to her thoughts. On that account, he also forgot the frightful occurrence for at least a few moments, and because of a feeling that the living reality would quickly disappear from him again, he tried to impress it accurately on his mind. Then, however, he became suddenly aware that if she did not quickly save herself, she might perish in the general destruction, and violent fear forced from him a cry of warning. She heard it too, for her head turned toward him, so that her face now appeared for a moment in full view, yet with an utterly incomprehending expression. And without paying any more attention to him, she continued in the same direction as before. At the same time, her face became paler, as if it were changing to white marble. She stepped up to the portico of the temple, and then, between the pillars, she sat down on a step and slowly laid her head upon it. Now the pebbles were falling in such masses that they condensed into a completely opaque curtain. Hastening quickly after, however, he found his way to the place where she had disappeared from his view, and there she lay, protected by the projecting roof, stretched out on the broad step, as if for sleep but no longer breathing, apparently stiffed by the sulfur fumes. From Vesuvius the red glow flared over her countenance, which, with closed eyes, was exactly like that of a beautiful statue. No fear nor distortion was apparent, but a strange equanimity, calmly submitting to the inevitable, was manifest in her features. Yet they quickly became more indistinct as the wind drove to the place the rain of ashes, which spread over them, first like a gray gauze veil, then extinguished the last glimpse of her face, and soon, like a northern winter snowfall, buried the whole figure under a smooth cover. Outside, the pillars of the temple of Apollo rose, now, however, only half of them, for the gray fall of ashes heaped itself likewise against them. Now, following the explication of the dream, Lotringer points out that for Freud, repression is utilized as a boundless license to interpretation. The repressed for Freud stems from a faulty translation, and that just gives Freud the license to interpret however he wants. And Lotringer says, an intensive constellation, sensory chaos with no direct attachment to the socius, it is indeed the dream prize of analysis. So the dream, as Lotringer says, is the via regia to the Freudian unconscious. It's the excuse to make shit up. As Lotringer says, he produced within the dream another scene and other signs configuring a new mental universe equally dependent upon the laws of representation. And that's important, of course. That dream interpretation, that's a Freudian slip if there ever was one, doesn't make sense of the signs of dreams, but merely overlays new signs, new environments on top, which are dominated by laws, by rules of representation, namely that such and such is represented by such and such. And Freud is basically there to decide what that is, to give you a unique interpretation that is bound to an objectivity of subjectivity, namely of the subjective framework of Freud, which is going to, somehow liberate your unconscious, which Freud is basically deciding. And for Lotringer, Freud's analysis leads to the point where language can basically make sense out of anything, even nonsense. It can lead to, for example, the famous, just one of the most egregious things of Freud's analysis of the Wolfman is this static dream becomes representative of this incredibly dynamic affair, namely the kid's parents having sex in front of him when he's young. And Freud's like, oh yeah, oftentimes things just reverse in the dream. So a static dream might represent a dynamic moment in real life. You just never know. It just depends. That's the problem. It just depends. Freud can justify completely turning itself on its head with no license other than his own say-so because, the unconscious likes to trick us. And Lotringer instead wants to affirm the forces struggling, either openly or covertly, to appropriate this tight and yet exploding sphere, this starburst, the dream. And the idea of the dream as a starburst carries the same connotations as Heidegger's Lichtung, of the clearing, that being is a clearing which opens out onto the world, right? It gives one license to do things, to be in the world. And as such, like I've said before, Lotringer is going to valorize the power of forgetfulness, which turns repetition of the same into the experience of difference liberated, of affects and flows and forces liberated to their own function, which isn't arrested by Freud's interpretive schema. And this is a common and great sort of Deleuze and Guattarian piece, where Deleuze and Guattari are very famous for saying, it's not about what something is, but what it does. Lotringer writes, there is actually no need to call upon the meaning of Norbert's emotion. I will rather consider the power it exerts upon him. And that right there is the difference between emotion and affect. Emotion is steeped in meaning, in representation, in signification. But affect is concerned with the power of a feeling which becomes impersonal, which wipes away one's sense of ego. And because of the power of this affective realm of the dream, there's something that is being preserved here, something which Freud says, of course, is Oedipus, that there's something being repressed here that needs to be retained somehow or needs to be, relinquished. But Lotringer says, no, this is about the power of the dream, of it meaning something right now. He says, inasmuch as becoming is represented as being, and the impersonal motions caught into a human, all too human emotion, it is immediately threatened by annihilation. And this is a quote from the dream. Then, however, he became suddenly aware that if she did not quickly save herself, she might perish in the general destruction, and violent fear forced him a cry of warning. And Lotringer points out that this anguish doesn't have anything to do with repression, at least not exclusively about repression. I mean, it could be about repression, but that's the problem is, for Freud, it has to be about repression. Instead of being worried about the past, Lotringer says that anguish is a product of the present. It arises by virtue of the living reality conferred upon Gradiva. Gradiva means something right now, and something she wouldn't mean 2 days ago or 2 days from now. This is like the idea that certain thoughts can only be thought at certain moments in time, that you need an environment in which something can make sense in such a way, in the Deleuzean sense of sense. So there's a present of this anguish, which makes it not reducible to repression, but rather has a impersonal power of its own, a post-human power, something that destroys the ego. Lotringer says, Gradiva's face, far from eliciting Norbert's subjective understanding, resolutely resists any such appropriation. The face in motion thus opposes its radical indifference to Norbert's differentiating anxiety. So this differentiating anxiety is really Freud. It is the essence of Freud's project, which is to reduce everything to a sort of scientific logic of interpretation, right? It's a hermeneutics of the dream, at least when we're talking about dream analysis specifically. But this face in motion, this sort of otherworldly face, which becomes paler as if it were changing to white marble, it enacts in the here and now, and as Lotringer says, it eludes the sway of expressive signs and the reign of repression, of representation as well. It refuses to give way. And of course, that's the power of the aesthetic for Nietzsche. That's the power of those things which go beyond our logical constructions, things like scientific discourses, for example. and opens us up to something completely new, which doesn't reduce to castration or repression or the Oedipus complex. Lotringer writes, the becoming mineral, on the other hand, takes Gradiva away from the powerful machine of logic. And this is a quote from The Dream. Her face became pale, as if it were changing to white marble. She continued to walk. End quote. Discoloration in no way indicates a loss of color. It rather gives access to a non-substantial, non-differential, and even transmortal state. To breathe no more, to become marble, puts to rest all the reductive oppositions. It produces a supernatural calm, alien to all danger, to all terror. Right? This isn't something that is necessarily feared. In fact, it's something enticing. Gradiva's power of sort of going beyond this life or death binary. Because, right, she's a statue of sorts. She's stone. Yet she walks, and even when you look at Gradiva, and this is an important thing that Lotringer points out, is that she's in step. She's in the moment. Lotringer says the non-representative and non-expressive power of the face is still haunted by the subjective economy, stifled, submissive, inevitable. An extra twist of the signs, and sleep becomes the metaphor of death, indifference, a submission to destroy. Gradiva's features, staying clear of such a neurotic reading, quickly become indistinct. So because Gradiva goes beyond that dualism of life or death, static or mobile, you can't really use the Freudian way of looking at it, because Gradiva doesn't reduce to some childhood event. Gradiva is its own thing. Lotringer writes, the totalization is actually at work in the genesis of individual terms through the imposition of language and the powerful assimilations it allows. Such is the via regia to psychoanalysis. One adheres closely to the primary processes, one swiftly embraces the libidinal flux only to channel them into the all-too-willing structures and implacable logic of language. But Lotringer says the elements of a dream refer to nothing. They are raw forces, distant yet proximate, almost combined, to paraphrase John Cage, within the same frame. And this is sort of Baudrillardian in a sense, that the elements of a dream don't have some objective sense of signification, but rather they have their own internal logic as a system which constitutes an environment of the dream, for example. And of course, it can be influenced by things beyond oneself, by forces and affects which push one to change. But there is a logic internal to the dream which demands its own reading. And of course, that's why Baudrillard is so interesting, because he's going to do these crazy analyses of terrorism, or of trade, or of popular culture, or of America. Stuff that focuses on looking at the system on its own terms and finding out its own logic, and not hoping for some objectivity of analysis, but just trying to figure out the power of the system itself. And as such, Lotringer tries to get beyond the burdensome clogs of finality in order to restore the flow of events, the overwhelming process of the world, beyond the cloggish need to censure, to abstract, to foresee, to possess. And getting beyond possession is important because Lotringer talks about, for example, how Freud just denies looking at music. Because Freud says some rationalistic or perhaps analytic turn of mind in me rebels against being moved by a thing without knowing why I am thus affected and what it is that affects me. Which to me just showcases Freud's stultifying approach to analysis. He has to make it static in order to understand it, instead of going with the flux of the dream, instead of letting the patient take him up. He has to be the narcissistic one who takes the high road, in kind of the pejorative sense, I guess, and tries to overwhelm the processes of the world of the dream. And instead of being in der Welt sein, being in the world, it's in der Freud sein. It's in Freud being, if that's even a way we can construct that. And in this moment, Lotringer turns to John Cage to look at a really interesting quote. "I wanted to avoid the melodic aspect," says Cage, "because melody entails will and the desire to bend the sounds to the will. Nevertheless, I do not reject melody. I reject it even less since it is self-endangered. But it must not begin by being imposed. I don't want to force sounds to follow me." That is such an important way of looking at this essay, because melody can be interpretation or meaning here. That trying to strive for melody or strive for a true interpretation requires using the will to bend objects to your will, which aren't necessarily meant to be so. They have their own autonomy, as I spoke of already. This is the sort of autonomy of objects, the bare objectivity of objects for Baudrillard that allows them to be seductive. And you'll see that in, for example, Symbolic Exchange and Death, and you'll also see that especially in Fatal Strategies. But despite Cage not necessarily striving for melody, he doesn't reject it either, just like Lotringer doesn't reject something meaning something. Obviously, things mean things to us. That's how we get along in the world, is using language and images and signs and sounds as a way to get around. But he doesn't reject melody because, as he mentions, it is self-endangered. And this is something that's within dream analysis too. The internal coherence of the system is itself always self-endangered by the tendency of the system to erupt, to break apart at its seams, at its rough edges of deterritorialization. And as such, Lotringer is trying to isolate and point out those rough edges of deterritorialization to bring out the self-endangerment of the dream, which has the power to affect one. But of course, you can take this too far in a schizoanalytic approach and you can lead to literal schizophrenia. So you just have to be careful about it and not impose a meaning or an interpretation upon a dream, but instead let it come to us. As Lotringer says, why then should one insist on forcing dreams, texts, words, and actions to signify? Keep the dream bursts apart. Let them resound together without filling the intervals that allow them to coexist in all their richness within dissonance. Let them act upon you. The dream is not to be envisioned in terms of secrecy and knowledge, but in terms of power, interpretive power. They send you off in search of something lying beneath the allegedly deformed production of oniric images, while in reality catching you, and this is, by the way, talking about psychoanalysis, catching you in the symbolic trap, in the rigged play of meaning. And Lotringer says, in response to the psychoanalytic, look at, some hidden unconscious is behind here, secret and just latent, waiting for us to interpret it, to find it through interpretation. Lotringer says, forget meaning and with it the subject. Repression cannot resist the folly of winds. Beauty will be amnesiac or will not be at all. So I hope this has been helpful in understanding a sort of anti-Freudian approach to dream analysis. You can see this as well in Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus at their look at Freud's analysis of the Wolfman, which is great. I've done a lecture on it, which might be helpful. Some of the best writing there towards the end of that chapter. Just the last paragraph is some of my favorite in all of philosophy. I hope this has been of some help. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, literature, anything else, become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you need help reading some thinker or passage, or maybe you want to talk about some philosophy problem. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another video.